All right. So we're diving into British fascism today, specifically Mosley.
Yeah.
Even before we start, I'm struck by all these contradictions in this guy.
Right. Well, the thing is, Mosley's path to fascism, it wasn't a straight line
Yeah.
at all. He starts out almost aristocratic, war hero,
Right.
captivating speaker. I mean, picture this. Young MP parliament, impassioned speeches about socialistic imperialism.
Socialistic imperialism.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
almost contradictory, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and it kind of speaks to the time, right? And Mosley himself, he was trying to kind of bridge these opposite ideologies,
Yeah.
appealing to both nationalist sentiment,
Right.
but also that desire for social reform. This was
Right.
before, those lines became as clearly drawn as they did later on.
It's hard to reconcile that with
Yeah.
with what we think of as,
Right.
fascism, the black
Yeah.
shirts, the rallies, all that stuff.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's what makes him so interesting to look at. He doesn't fit that stereotypical mold
Right.
of a fascist dictator. Early career, conservative, then the move to labor.
Yeah.
It suggests a genuine, desire for change.
Right.
Like a real intellectual restlessness
Yeah.
that you don't see with those figures very often.
And that intellectual restlessness, you really see it in his economic ideas, especially the Mosley Memorandum. I mean,
Yeah.
from what I've read, it's like he's predicting
Yeah.
both Roosevelt's New Deal
Right.
and aspects of Nazi economic policy.
Well, the memorandum, it's really quite a remarkable document. He's calling for, government intervention in the economy.
Right.
Massive public works projects,
Wow.
even, a team of economic experts to guide the country. I mean, these were radical ideas for the time, especially from someone who had been a conservative MP. It shows just how far he was willing to go to find solutions to Britain's economic woes.
Yeah, but I mean, those solutions weren't exactly welcomed by the old guard in the Labor Party.
No, definitely not. I mean, they viewed his ideas as too radical,
Right.
too disruptive. They simply were not ready for that level of economic change.
Right.
And this is where you start to see, Mosley's frustration
Right.
and impatience really building, he felt like, the established system was holding Britain back, that it was too slow, too bureaucratic to deal with the crises facing the country.
So he breaks from Labor and forms his own party,
Right.
the New Party. But from what I gather, it didn't really light the world on fire, did it?
No, it was short-lived.
Yeah.
To say the least. It did, however, demonstrate Mosley's ambition
Right.
and his willingness to break from the status quo
Or,
to achieve his goals. But the real turning point
yeah.
comes with his trip to Italy.
This is where things take a bit of a darker turn,
Yeah.
right? He meets Mussolini and is enamored by the whole spectacle.
He's captivated by the rallies, by the uniforms.
Right.
That sense of, power and action. He sees the appeal of strong leader who promises to just cut through the bureaucracy and make things happen. Keep in mind, this is the early 1930s,
Right.
a time of, immense economic and social upheaval
Yeah.
across Europe. Democracy is being challenged in many places. And fascism, with its emphasis on order and strength, it offered a pretty seductive alternative for some.
Right.
Yeah.
So he comes back to Britain, seemingly having found his true calling.
Right. And in October 1932, he launches the British Union of Fascists, the BUF.
The birth of British fascism as we know it. But here's what I find kind of perplexing. Like, the BUF has these surprisingly modern elements to it, like appealing to women and the working class, focusing on economic revitalization rather than military expansion.
Right.
It's a far cry from what we typically associate with fascism.
It's certainly a different flavor of fascism than, what we see in Germany or Italy.
Right.
It's more about, national rebirth, restoring Britain to its former glory.
Right.
But it's still deeply problematic, particularly in its embrace of authoritarianism.
Right.
And those, seeds of anti-Semitism that are already present.
And looking back, it's easy to wonder, like, how could anyone have fallen for this?
Right.
But you have to remember the context. Right?
Exactly.
In the 1930s, the fear of communism was very real.
Very real, yeah.
And to some, fascism seemed like a viable alternative.
Right. And let's not forget Mosley's charisma. I mean, the guy was a master orator, skilled at playing on people's anxieties, their aspirations. He painted this picture of Britain in decline, betrayed by these weak politicians, undermined by shadowy forces.
Right.
His solution, action, strength, a return to traditional values.
And, reading through this material, I was really stunned to see some of the names of his early supporters, like
Oh, yeah.
Lord Rothermere, a powerful press baron, and even like T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, expressing admiration for this movement.
It really speaks to Mosley's ability to draw in people from different segments of society, you know? But even with this early support, cracks were beginning to show. I mean, there was unease, especially around that growing presence of anti-Semitism within the movement.
And then there's the whole episode with Lord Rothermere and the Daily Mail.
Right.
With that infamous "Hurrah for the Black Shirts" article.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to believe a major newspaper would just openly support a fascist movement, even for a brief period.
It's important to remember that the term fascism, it didn't carry the same weight and horror that it does today. For some, it represented a break from the perceived failures of traditional politics. Rothermere, for example. He was drawn to Mosley's economic ideas and his strong stance against communism.
But that support was pretty fleeting.
Yes.
What caused that shift?
Well, there's a pivotal event that took place in June 1934, a BUF rally at Olympia. Thousands of people attended, including over 100 members of parliament. Imagine the scene, Flags, floodlights, Mosley's voice just booming through the hall.
Sounds like something out of like a Leni Riefenstahl film,
Right.
A classic fascist spectacle.
Exactly. Except it takes a dark turn. Mosley starts getting heckled, which, wasn't uncommon at political rallies back then.
Right.
But instead of, ignoring it or responding verbally, Mosley has his black shirts, these thugs, armed with, knuckle dusters, truncheons, brutally attack anyone who dares to speak out against him. I mean, it was a calculated display of violence, the spotlights right on the hecklers. Mosley stopped speaking until they were dealt with. Like, he wanted to really send a message,
Wow.
about his willingness to silence opposition through force.
So it goes from a political rally to basically a riot.
Pretty much. And it's a turning point, A lot of people, even those who had been kind of sympathetic to Mosley, were appalled by the brutality. A conservative MP even writes to the Times.
Oh, wow.
Describing the violence as un-English, un-Tory, which for someone like Mosley, that must have really stung.
And that's where the BUF starts to lose its legitimacy.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And Mosley starts to alienate these key allies.
Precisely. The violence at Olympia, combined with, what's happening in Germany at the time, the Night of the Long Knives, it really made people reconsider their support for Mosley in the BUF. The movement, it never really recovers from that loss of respectability.
It's amazing how much these external events, the rise of Hitler, the violence in Germany, had an impact on how people saw the BUF here in Britain.
Right. It's a reminder that these movements don't exist in a vacuum. What's happening in one country, it can really have these ripple effects, across borders, especially when it comes to ideologies like fascism.
Okay, before we go further, I want to take a step back and try to understand the BUF's appeal. Beyond the kind of superficial stuff.
Yeah.
Who were these people that were drawn to this movement?
Yeah.
Was it just angry veterans, disillusioned aristocrats?
Right.
Or was there something more to it?
It was definitely more nuanced than that. I mean, remember, this is the 1930s.
Right.
Britain's still reeling from World War I.
Right.
The economy's a mess. There's this deep sense of uncertainty, anxiety about the future. People were looking for answers, for someone to blame.
And so Mosley kind of steps in with this simple, powerful narrative, Britain in decline, betrayed by weak politicians.
Yeah.
We've heard that story before.
Yeah, so it's a familiar playbook.
Right.
Yeah, he offers the scapegoat.
Right.
Communists, Jews, anyone who didn't fit into his vision of a strong, unified nation. And he offered a solution. Action. Strength. A return to traditional values.
Yeah, and it's scary how effective that kind of rhetoric can be, especially in times of crisis,
Absolutely. And Mosley understood the power of spectacle.
Yeah.
And symbolism. He used rallies, marches, uniforms, all those tools of fascist propaganda to create this aura of power. and excitement around the BUF, he
Yeah.
knew how to appeal to emotion,
Yeah.
tap into those underlying anxieties, frustrations.
And, I mean, it worked, right?
Right.
At least for a time. You mentioned the BUF had tens of thousands of members at its peak. So, I mean, this wasn't just like the fringe elements of society.
No, it wasn't. They attracted people from all walks of life, factory workers, shopkeepers, clerks, even some, intellectuals and artists.
Huh.
They were drawn to Mosley's, charisma, his energy, his promise of a better future.
But it's like a twisted kind of optimism, isn't it? A belief that, a strong leader, even one with these authoritarian tendencies, could solve all their problems.
Yeah, it's a dangerous kind of optimism, that's for sure.
Right.
And it speaks to this deeper yearning for stability and order, especially in times of upheaval. Mosley tapped into that yearning really, really well.
But how do you square that with his earlier views?
Right. Yeah.
When he was talking about social reform, like even flirting with socialism,
Yeah.
earlier in his career, how do you reconcile that with him embracing fascism?
Yeah, I mean, that's the paradox of Mosley, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he was a complex, even contradictory figure, capable of, great idealism,
Yeah.
but also great cruelty. I mean, he could be intellectually insightful, but also blatantly,
Yeah.
demagogic. It's like he was constantly searching for the right formula, to achieve his ambitions. And unfortunately, that search led him down a very, very dark path.
And he wasn't operating in isolation.
Right.
I mean, fascism was gaining ground all across Europe in the 1930s.
Right.
Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy. These were powerful models for someone like Mosley.
Right, they were. And while, Mosley was convinced that British fascism would be different, tailored to the unique character of the nation, he certainly drew inspiration from what was happening elsewhere. He saw himself as this modernizer, a revolutionary who would sweep away the old order and create this new, more dynamic Britain.
And part of that sweeping away involved violence. We talked about the Olympia rally, but I got something here in my notes called the Battle of Cable Street.
Oh, yeah.
What can you tell me about that?
Cable Street. This is a pivotal moment in the history of British fascism, a clash that really exposed those deep divisions in British society. In October 1936, the BUF planned a march through the East End of London, a predominantly Jewish area. Their goal was to, provoke a confrontation, to assert their dominance.
So they got confrontation.
Oh, yeah. Thousands of anti-fascist protesters, led by communists, trade unionists, Jewish groups, turned out to block the BUF's path. I mean, barricades were built.
Right.
Rocks and bottles were thrown. There was, this fierce hand-to-hand fighting with the black shirts.
It sounds like a scene out of a movie, a real clash of ideologies playing out on the street.
It was chaotic and violent. I mean, a battle for the very soul of London, you could say. The police, they were overwhelmed, and in the end, the BUF was forced to abandon its march.
So that's a victory for the anti-fascists.
It was a symbolic victory, for sure.
Right.
Cable Street showed that Mosley and the BUF weren't invincible, that there was this widespread opposition to their message of hate.
Yeah.
But it also revealed that potential for violence, that simmering tension beneath the surface of British society.
And it's a reminder that, even in a democracy like Britain, these extremist ideologies can take hold.
Yeah.
Especially in times of uncertainty and fear.
Precisely. And it's a warning that we can't afford to be complacent, The battle against fascism, against all forms of intolerance and hate, it's an ongoing struggle.
Yeah.
One that requires, constant vigilance.
Right.
And a willingness to stand up for what's right.
It makes you wonder, what if the BUF had been successful?
Yeah.
What if they had gained more power, more influence?
That's a chilling thought. Thankfully, it never came to pass. The violence at Olympia, the Battle of Cable Street, the growing awareness of the horrors,
Right.
unfolding in Nazi Germany, all of these factors contributed to the BUF's decline.
So Mosley's dream of a fascist Britain, ultimately, it failed.
Yes, but it was a close call.
Yeah.
And his story, it serves as this cautionary tale about the dangers of, unchecked ambition, the seduction of authoritarianism,
Yeah.
and the corrosive power of hate.
You've mentioned a few times that he was a complex figure,
Right.
Not just some two-dimensional villain. Do you think that he really believed in fascism?
Right.
Or was it more about power?
Yeah.
about achieving his goals no matter what.
I mean, that's the question historians are still debating, right?
Right.
Was he a true believer, or was he just this cynical opportunist? I mean, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. He was clearly attracted to that power and spectacle of fascism.
Right.
But he also seemed to genuinely believe that his vision of a strong, unified Britain was the right path for the nation, even if it meant, trampling on individual rights
Yeah.
and embracing this hateful ideology.
I mean, it's a reminder that even intelligent, charismatic people can fall prey to dangerous ideologies,
Yeah.
especially when those ideologies offer, easy answers
Yeah.
to complicated problems.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so crucial to understand the allure of these ideologies, to recognize those warning signs,
Right.
and to challenge them whenever and wherever they arise.
So what's the takeaway here
Yeah.
for our listeners?
Yeah.
What can we learn from Mosley's rise and fall, from this kind of dark chapter in British history?
I think the biggest lesson is that we can't take democracy for granted.
Right.
It's fragile, and it requires constant vigilance and active participation from all of us.
Right.
We need to be aware of those dangers of extremism, the seductive nature of simple answers to complex problems.
Yeah.
And we need to be willing to speak out against intolerance and hate, to defend the values of freedom and equality that underpin a healthy democratic society.
It's a good reminder that, history isn't just something that happened in the past.
Right.
It's a mirror reflecting our own challenges,
Right.
our own choices.
Yeah.
Mosley's story is a cautionary tale, but it's also a call to action.
Right.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in safeguarding our democracy
Yeah.
and building a more just and equitable world.
Well said.
Before we move on to the final chapter of Mosley's story, let's dig a little deeper into these shadowy forces, that he was always going on about.
Yeah.
You mentioned anti-Semitism. How central was that to the BUF's ideology and tactics?
Yeah.
I mean, was it just kind of background noise?
Right.
Or was it more deeply ingrained in their message?
It wasn't just background noise, no. It became much more central to the BUF's message, I think, as the movement evolved. Initially, Mosley kind of downplayed it.
Right.
Maybe he saw it as a distraction from his broader goals.
Right.
The economic and political stuff.
But as we said, there were anti-Semites within the BUF, like right from the start.
Right, exactly. And their voices, they got louder,
Yeah.
over time. They saw Jews as kind of embodying everything they disliked about modern society, global finance, cosmopolitan culture, a perceived lack of patriotism.
Right.
They used those, those classic anti-Semitic tropes, painting Jews as both capitalists and communists,
Right.
manipulators of the financial system, agents of international revolution.
It's a classic scapegoating.
Yeah, exactly. As the BUF's popularity started to fade,
Right.
They needed a target for their frustrations.
Right.
And Jews became that target.
Yeah.
Mosley himself started using more explicitly anti-Semitic language, accusing Jews of being behind everything from Britain's economic woes to, these shadowy communist conspiracies.
It's chilling to hear that.
Yeah.
Even now, knowing where it led in other parts of Europe.
Yeah.
Did that shift towards more overt anti-Semitism, did that turn away any of their supporters?
It did, yeah. I mean, think back to Lord Rothermere and that whole hurrah for the black shirts thing.
Right.
He eventually withdrew his support, citing the BUF's growing anti-Semitism as a primary reason.
So even someone who was initially sympathetic to fascism, drawn in by, Mosley's charisma and those economic ideas,
Right.
they had a limit.
They did, yeah. And that's an important point. I mean, not everyone who was attracted to the BUF's message of, national renewal was okay with the anti-Semitism. But that increasingly hateful rhetoric, it made it impossible for many to keep supporting them.
Then, of course, the world gets plunged into another war. How did World War II impact Mosley and the BUF?
The war was really the final nail in the coffin for British fascism. Mosley's opposition to the war, his calls for appeasement with Hitler,
Right.
it made him incredibly unpopular. I mean, he was seen as a traitor, someone who was siding with the enemy.
And I imagine that whole, black shirts and rallies aesthetic, it probably didn't help his case much.
No, not at all. It smacked of the very regime they were now fighting.
Right.
In 1940, under the defense regulations, Mosley and hundreds of other BUF members, they were interned, essentially dismantling the movement. The government, they saw them as a threat to national security. And given their stance on the war and their increasingly violent tactics, it's hard to argue with that.
So after all the speeches, all the rallies, the violence, these attempts to reshape Britain
Yay.
in his own image,
Yeah.
Mosley ends up in prison. Quite a fall from grace.
A fitting end, some might say.
Yeah.
I mean, Mosley's story, it's a stark reminder, I think, of the dangers of unchecked ambition, you know, that seduction of authoritarianism.
Right.
And that just corrosive power of hate.
And you said earlier that he was a complex figure, you know, not just some two-dimensional bad guy.
Right.
Do you think that he really believed in fascism?
Right.
Or was it more about, just raw power?
Yeah.
Just achieving his goals no matter the cost?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, historians are still debating that. Was he a true believer, or was he a cynical opportunist? The truth probably lies somewhere in between, He was clearly attracted to the power and the spectacle of fascism, but, he also seemed to genuinely believe that his vision for Britain, the strong, unified Britain, was the right path.
Right.
Even if it meant, like trampling on individual rights and embracing this ideology of hate.
It just goes to show you that even, smart, charismatic people,
Right.
they can fall prey to dangerous ideologies.
Yeah.
Especially when those ideologies offer, simple solutions to complex problems. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important, I think, to really understand the appeal of these ideologies, to recognize those warning signs,
Right.
and to challenge them whenever they pop up.
So what's the takeaway here for our listeners? And what can we learn from Mosley's rise and fall, from this, dark chapter in British history?
I think the biggest lesson is that we can't take democracy for granted. It's fragile.
Right.
It requires constant vigilance and participation from all of us.
Right.
We need to be aware of the dangers of extremism, the seductive nature of simple answers to complex problems.
Yeah.
And we need to be willing to speak out against intolerance and hate,
Yeah.
to defend those values of freedom and equality that make up a healthy democratic society.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good reminder that, history isn't just something that happened in the past.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
it's a mirror reflecting our own, challenges, our own choices.
Yeah.
Mosley's story it's a cautionary tale, but it's also a call to action.
Right.
A reminder that we all have a role to play in safeguarding our democracy and building a more just and equitable world.
Well said. I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Oswald Mosley and the rise and fall of British fascism.
Yeah, I think so too. Thanks for guiding us through this, fascinating and sometimes unsettling journey.
It was my pleasure, like always,
Yeah.
I learned something new every time we delve into these historical rabbit holes.
Me too.
Oh.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay vigilant.